In 1833, Britain fought a war to protect drug dealers. Not metaphorically, literally. The British Empire deployed warships, soldiers, and diplomatic pressure to ensure that Chinese ports remained open to British opium smugglers. And when China tried to stop this drug trade that was destroying millions of lives, Britain declared war. They call it the First Opium War, and Britain won decisively. The result was a treaty that forced China to pay Britain massive compensation, cede Hong Kong permanently, and continue allowing British merchants to flood Chinese markets with addictive narcotics. This wasn't some rogue operation by criminal enterprises. This was official British policy supported by the government, financed by respected London banks, and celebrated in British newspapers as a victory for free trade. For over a century, the British Empire built its wealth on what was essentially the world's largest drug cartel, and the profits were staggering. Opium revenues funded the expansion of British India, financed the Industrial Revolution, and created fortunes that built some of Britain's most prestigious institutions. But here's what they don't teach you in history class. The opium trade wasn't just about money. It was about power. It was about control. It was about creating economic dependency that would last for generations. And the methods Britain used to build and protect this drug empire became the blueprint for modern economic warfare. The same tactics, the same strategies, the same justifications that Britain used to force opium onto China are being used by nations today to control global markets. In this video, I'm going to show you exactly how Britain built the most profitable criminal enterprise in human history, how they disguised it as legitimate commerce, and how the wealth from this drug trade shaped the modern world in ways most people never realize. We'll trace the money from poppy fields in India to banking houses in London, from Chinese ports to British factories, and from government policies to personal fortunes that still exist today. Before we get started, smash the like button and subscribe if you love financial deep dives. Comment your city and the time you're watching this. I want to see how global this community is. The story begins in 1757, not with opium, but with conquest. The British East India Company defeated local rulers at the Battle of Plaque and gained control over Bengal, the richest province in India. But here's the problem they immediately faced. Britain desperately wanted Chinese goods: tea, silk, porcelain, spices. Chinese products were in massive demand across Europe, and China had a monopoly on the highest quality versions of these luxury items. But China didn't want anything Britain had to offer. The Chinese considered European manufactured goods inferior to their own. They had no interest in British textiles, British metal goods, British technology, nothing. The only thing China would accept in payment for their exports was silver. Real silver, minted coins, precious metal that Britain had to acquire from other countries at significant cost. This created what economists call a trade deficit. But it was more than that. It was economic humiliation. Silver was flowing out of Britain at an unprecedented rate. Chinese merchants were getting rich selling to British customers, while British merchants were essentially acting as middlemen, moving Spanish and South American silver from European markets to Chinese ports and taking a small commission. The East India Company calculated that between 1700 and 1750, Britain had exported over 50 million pounds sterling worth of silver to China. That's roughly 15 billion pounds in today's money flowing out of British coffers into Chinese hands, with nothing coming back except goods that British consumers were demanding more of every year. British merchants were frustrated. British politicians were concerned, and British investors in the East India Company were demanding solutions. How do you reverse a trade deficit when the other country doesn't want anything you produce? The answer, they decided, was to create demand artificially defined or create a product that Chinese consumers would want badly enough to pay for with their silver, reversing the flow of precious metal. That product was opium. Opium wasn't new. It had been used medically in China for centuries in small quantities. But recreational opium use was limited, and the Chinese government had banned its importation in 1729. Recognizing the dangers of widespread addiction, the prohibition was clear. The penalties were severe, and Chinese authorities actively enforced the ban. But prohibition creates opportunity for those willing to break the law, and the British East India Company, with its control over Bengal's poppy fields, was perfectly positioned to become the primary supplier of illegal drugs to the Chinese market. The East India Company didn't start growing opium in India. Indian farmers had been cultivating opium poppies for centuries, selling small quantities for legitimate medical use. But under British control, opium production was transformed into an industrial operation. The company established a monopoly over opium cultivation, forcing Indian farmers to grow poppies instead of food crops, setting fixed prices below market rates and controlling every aspect of production and distribution. By 1780, the East India Company was producing over 4,000 chests of opium annually. Each chest contained about 140 pounds of processed opium. That's over 500,000 pounds of illegal drugs being manufactured under British supervision every year, and production was increasing rapidly. The logistics were sophisticated. Opium was processed in government factories in Patna and Benares, packed in specially designed chests, transported to Kolkata under armed guard, and then shipped to Canton, the only Chinese port where foreign merchants were allowed to trade. But here's where it gets interesting. The East India Company couldn't sell opium directly. That would make them obviously guilty of drug smuggling, violating Chinese law, and potentially provoking military retaliation. Instead, they created a system of plausible deniability. The company sold opium at public auctions in Kolkata to private merchants, mostly British and American traders who specialized in high-risk, high-reward commerce. These private merchants then transported the opium to China and handled the actual smuggling operations. The East India Company collected massive revenues from the auctions, while maintaining they weren't responsible for what happened to the opium after it left their warehouses. This wasn't a small-scale operation. By 1820, the East India Company was auctioning over 4,000 chests annually. By 1830, over 18,000 chests. By 1838, over 40,000 chests. That's nearly 6 million pounds of illegal drugs flowing into China every year, all originating from British-controlled territory, all generating revenue for the British Empire. The profits were extraordinary. Opium cost roughly 400 rupees per chest to produce in India. The same chest sold for 200 to 2,000 rupees at the Kolkata auctions depending on quality and market conditions. That's a 300 to 500% markup before the drugs even left British territory. Then private merchants sold the opium in China for 2,000 to 4,000 Spanish dollars per chest, doubling their money again. The East India Company's opium revenues grew from 1 million annually in 1800 to over 6 million annually by 1838. To put this in perspective, opium sales represented roughly 1/17 of the company's total revenue from India, the territory that generated most of Britain's colonial wealth. Opium wasn't a side business. It was a core component of British imperial finance. But the money was just the beginning. The real genius of the opium trade was how it solved Britain's trade deficit with China. Instead of shipping silver to China to pay for tea and silk, British merchants were now shipping opium. Chinese consumers paid silver for British drugs, and that silver was then used to buy Chinese exports. The flow of precious metal had reversed completely. By 1838, China was importing over 1,400 tons of British opium annually and paying for it with silver that had previously stayed in Chinese hands. The trade deficit that had plagued Britain for over a century was not only eliminated, but reversed. Silver was now flowing from China to Britain, and the opium trade was generating the currency needed to purchase Chinese goods without depleting British reserves. The transformation was remarkable. In 1700, Britain was essentially a client state economically, dependent on Chinese products and forced to pay with scarce silver. By 1838, Britain had created artificial demand for an addictive product that generated massive revenues and solved the balance of payments problem simultaneously. But success created its own problems. As opium imports increased, Chinese addiction rates exploded. Estimates suggest that by 1838, over 12 million Chinese were regular opium users, and addiction was spreading through all levels of society. Chinese productivity was declining. Silver was leaving the country at unprecedented rates, and social problems were mounting. The Chinese government faced a crisis that threatened the stability of the entire empire, and their response would trigger the events that transformed Britain's drug trade from a profitable criminal enterprise into the foundation of a global empire. The Chinese Emperor Dao Guang appointed Lin Zexu as imperial commissioner in 1839 with one mandate: eliminate the opium trade completely. Lin wasn't a typical bureaucrat. He was known for his incorruptibility, his efficiency, and his willingness to take on powerful interests. The emperor had chosen the one official in the empire who couldn't be bought, threatened, or deterred. Lin arrived in Canton and immediately understood the scope of the problem. This wasn't just foreign merchants selling drugs. This was a systematic operation involving Chinese officials who were being bribed, Chinese merchants who were profiting, and Chinese consumers who were addicted. The corruption went from the ports to the provincial governments to the imperial court itself. His first move was brilliant and terrifying. Lin surrounded the foreign factories in Canton with troops and demanded that every foreign merchant surrender their opium stocks, not just current inventory, but all opium in warehouses, on ships, and in transit. And he demanded they sign pledges promising never to deal in opium again, with the penalty for violation being death. The foreign merchants were trapped. Lin had cut off food supplies to the foreign quarter. No one could leave. No ships could depart. The Chinese had essentially taken the entire foreign trading community hostage until they complied with the opium surrender. Charles Elliot, the British superintendent of trade, faced an impossible situation. If he allowed British merchants to surrender their opium, he was acknowledging that Britain had been engaged in illegal drug smuggling. If he refused, the Chinese might execute British subjects or expel British trade entirely. His solution was to make the opium surrender a matter of British government policy. Elliot ordered all British merchants to surrender their opium to him. As the official representative of the British Crown, he promised that the British government would compensate them for their losses. This was crucial because it transformed a dispute between Chinese authorities and private drug dealers into a conflict between the Chinese Empire and the British Empire. Over 20,000 chests of opium were surrendered. That's nearly 3 million pounds of drugs worth approximately $2 million sterling. Lin had the entire stockpile destroyed publicly, mixing the opium with salt and lime and flushing it into the sea. For weeks, the Pearl River ran black with dissolved narcotics. But Lin made a critical miscalculation. He believed that destroying the opium and forcing the pledges would end British drug smuggling. He underestimated how central opium revenues had become to British imperial finance, and how far Britain would go to protect this income stream. The British government's response was swift and decisive. They declared that China had committed acts of war by seizing British property without compensation, and by threatening British subjects with execution for engaging in what Britain claimed was legitimate trade. The fact that opium was illegal under Chinese law was irrelevant, Britain argued, because Chinese laws were unjust and violated the principles of free commerce. Lord Palmerston, the British Foreign Secretary, sent a clear message to Parliament and to China. Britain would not allow any foreign government to dictate what British merchants could sell, or where they could sell it. If China wanted to prohibit opium, they were free to do so within their own territory, but they could not interfere with British commerce outside Chinese territorial waters, or seize British property without facing military consequences. This wasn't really about opium anymore. This was about establishing the principle that British commercial interests superseded foreign laws, foreign sovereignty, and foreign objections. The opium trade had become a test case for whether Britain could impose its will on any nation that attempted to restrict British commerce. The military preparations were extensive. Britain assembled a fleet of 16 warships for armed steamers and 27 transport vessels carrying 4,000 troops. The force included the latest military technology, steam-powered gunboats that could navigate Chinese rivers, modern artillery that outranged Chinese cannons, and disciplined infantry trained in European warfare tactics. But the real weapon was economic warfare. Britain imposed a blockade on Chinese ports, cutting off the trade that Chinese merchants depended on. No British ships would carry Chinese goods. No British merchants would purchase Chinese exports. The message was clear. China could choose between allowing the opium trade to continue or losing access to British commerce entirely. The First Opium War began in June 1840 when British forces attacked Chinese forts near Canton. The military outcome was never in doubt. British steamships could outmaneuver Chinese junks. British artillery could destroy Chinese fortifications from distances that Chinese cannons couldn't reach. British infantry could defeat Chinese forces in any direct engagement. But the war wasn't just about military victory. It was about demonstrating that any attempt to interfere with British commercial interests would result in consequences far more costly than simply accepting British terms. China could spend enormous sums defending their territory and fighting a war they couldn't win, or they could negotiate a settlement that preserved the opium trade while giving Britain additional commercial advantages. The psychological impact was devastating. Chinese forces that had dominated Asian warfare for centuries were being systematically defeated by a relatively small British force operating thousands of miles from home. Chinese fortifications that had protected major ports were being reduced to rubble by British naval bombardment. Chinese officials who had confidently confronted foreign merchants were now begging for negotiations. By 1842, British forces had captured Shanghai, controlled the Yangtze River, and were threatening Beijing itself. The Chinese government faced complete military collapse or surrender. They chose surrender, but the terms would reshape not just the opium trade, but the entire relationship between China and the Western world. The Treaty of Nanking, signed in August 1842, was the most one-sided agreement in Chinese history. China paid Britain 21 million silver dollars in compensation. That's roughly $4 million sterling, equivalent to approximately 400 million pounds today. China ceded Hong Kong to Britain permanently, giving the British Empire a strategic base for future operations in Asia. 5 Chinese ports were open to British trade, with British merchants given the right to reside permanently in these cities under British rather than Chinese law. British subjects in China would be tried in British courts under British law, regardless of what crimes they committed on Chinese territory. But the treaty didn't explicitly legalize opium. That would have been too obvious, too embarrassing for both sides. Instead, the treaty established the principle of free trade and prohibited China from interfering with legitimate British commerce. The definition of legitimate commerce was left deliberately vague, but everyone understood that opium fell under this protection. The result was explosive growth in the opium trade. Without Chinese interference, British merchants could operate openly rather than through smuggling networks. Private dealers could establish permanent operations in Chinese ports, rather than conducting business from ships anchored offshore. The infrastructure for drug distribution could be built systematically, rather than improvised constantly. Opium imports to China increased from 40,000 chests annually before the war to over 65,000 chests annually by 1850. The East India Company's opium revenues, which had already been massive, nearly doubled within a decade of the treaty. But the real prize wasn't just the increased drug sales. The real prize was the precedent. Britain had successfully used military force to compel a foreign government to accept British commercial terms regardless of that government's laws, values, or interests. The principle established in China would be applied globally as Britain expanded its empire and imposed similar treaties on other nations. The opium wealth flowed through every level of British society. East India Company's shareholders received dividends funded by drug sales. British banks financed opium shipments and earned interest on loans secured by drug inventories. British shipping companies transported opium and earned freight revenues. British insurance companies covered opium cargoes and collected premiums based on the enormous profits involved. The money reached far beyond the individuals directly involved in the trade. Opium revenues helped finance the British military forces that protected the empire. They funded infrastructure projects in India that facilitated resource extraction. They provided capital for industrial development that gave Britain manufacturing advantages over other European powers. India that capital for industrial extraction. They facilitated resource European powers. The wealth transformation was systematic and far-reaching. British textile mills in Manchester and Liverpool used opium profits to purchase new machinery and expand production capacity. The same revenues that flowed from Chinese addiction funded the Industrial Revolution. That made Britain the workshop of the world. Cotton mills, iron foundries, coal mines, railway construction all received investment capital that originated in the poppy fields of Bengal and the addiction centers of Canton. London banking houses like Jardine Matt, Denton Company, and Russell and Company became financial powerhouses by specializing in opium finance. These weren't back-alley money changers. These were respectable institutions that handled the accounts of British aristocracy, financed government bonds, and underwrote legitimate commercial ventures. But their core profitability came from managing the complex financial networks required to move drug money across continents. The banking operations were sophisticated beyond anything seen in previous centuries. Letters of credit issued in London could be redeemed in Canton. Silver purchased with opium revenues in China could be transferred to accounts in Kolkata. Within months, currency exchanges that normally took years to complete were handled in weeks, through networks built specifically to serve the drug trade. Jardine Matt alone handled over 30% of all opium transactions between India and China by 1850. Their annual revenues exceeded those of most European governments. William Jardine and James Matt, the Scottish merchants who founded the firm, became two of the wealthiest men in Britain. Jardine used his fortune to purchase estates in Scotland and seats in Parliament. Matt bought the entire island of Lewis in the Scottish Hebs and built one of the largest private residences in Britain. But the real transformation was institutional. British universities, hospitals, museums, and charitable foundations received endowments funded by opium wealth. The British Museum, Oxford and Cambridge colleges, the Royal Geographic Society, all benefited from donations made by men who built their fortunes on Chinese addiction. These institutions didn't question the source of the money. They celebrated their benefactors as successful entrepreneurs and patriots who had expanded British commerce. The moral justification was elaborate and carefully constructed. British newspapers described the opium trade as bringing civilization to backward nations. British politicians argued that free trade was a natural right that no government could legitimately restrict. British economists claimed that any interference with commerce harmed both buyer and seller. By preventing mutually beneficial exchanges, the Chinese were portrayed as stubborn, irrational, and hostile to progress. Their attempts to prohibit opium were described as evidence of their failure to understand modern commercial principles. British writers argued that Chinese addiction was caused by character flaws, rather than by the addictive properties of the drugs being imported. If Chinese consumers couldn't control their opium use, that was a Chinese problem, not a British responsibility. This narrative became so pervasive that most British citizens genuinely believed they were benefiting China by forcing open Chinese markets. The idea that Britain was operating a massive drug cartel seemed absurd to people who'd been told repeatedly that they were spreading the benefits of free trade and modern civilization. The profits generated demand for expansion. If opium worked in China, why not elsewhere? British merchants began exploring markets in Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and anywhere else large populations existed with limited access to addictive substances. The infrastructure built for the China trade could be adapted to serve new markets. With minimal additional investment, Burma became the next target after British forces conquered Lower Burma in 1852. Opium cultivation was introduced using the same monopoly system perfected in Bengal. Burmese farmers were forced to grow poppies and the processed opium was exported to regional markets. Within a decade, Burma was producing significant quantities of opium for distribution throughout Southeast Asia. The pattern was always the same. Military conquest created political control. Political control enabled commercial monopolies. Commercial monopolies generated enormous revenues that funded further military expansion. The drug wealth became a self-perpetuating cycle that drove British imperial expansion across Asia and eventually into Africa and the Middle East. By 1860, opium revenues represented roughly 15% of the total income of British India. That's equivalent to the entire budget of most European nations. The British Empire had become financially dependent on drug sales to a degree that made abandoning the trade economically impossible. Any attempt to eliminate opium commerce would have required massive tax increases or spending cuts that would have destabilized the entire imperial system.